Hello, good morning, everybody. I'm gonna be talking through Grain of Wheat today so that we can basically just give you guys a video so that you can be going back. I know that Brian went over some of the basics in the class and you had some discussion last week while I was absent, and thank you so much for dealing, bearing with me. I was in quarantine last week and I'm fine, I'm back, I'm out, I'm talking and breathing, which are all good things. But I was also quarantined without Wi-Fi, which is a very unpleasant situation to be in. But I am now back in the world, and Wi-Fi is coming home this weekend, so I will have something. So I'm gonna just sort of talk you through some of the slides, which hopefully you've had a look at up on Moodle. I'll break this up into some small videos so you can kind of come back to the essential components. So just to start out with our author here, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who is also often known as James Ngugi. He started writing as James Ngugi and then kind of rejected the Anglicization, the British influence of James in his name, and went for kind of the more Kenyan traditional Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Grain of Wheat, which we're looking at today. Here we go. Beautiful, beautiful. Grain of Wheat is a really fascinating novel, and it's in many ways one of his biggest and most significant works. It occurs very much at a kind of crossroads period in both Ngugi's life and in kind of the history of Kenyan colonization, because it's about Kenyan freedom, and it really kind of shows a society that is on the brink of change. They already know they're going to have their freedom at the time that the events are happening, at the time indeed that Ngugi was writing, but they're sort of setting up what's going to happen and also trying to decode what has happened. So we kind of have the mystery about kind of about Mugo and about the freedom fighters, and kind of who's been involved in what, who's been involved in kind of the oaths, who is working for the British, and what happens for the people who were working for the British. Now, Ngugi, as you've probably already worked out, was very kind of anti-British rule in Kenya, and so a lot of people are often quite surprised to learn that he was actually detained by the Kenyan government, by the liberated Kenyan government, for his kind of outspoken criticism of that government when the kind of the free Kenya was instated. So he's lived in exile for the last ages. I know we have our slides here. Yeah, if you bring up the slide of Ngugi there, you will see. He's lived in exile since 1982. He's not been able to return to his home country, and I think that's something that his later writing really shows, this complicated relationship with a home that promised so much and this great hope of freedom, but what it actually turned out to be, not what was dreamed of. Not, kind of one oppressor was replaced by another. And interestingly, in Grain of Wheat, obviously this is written before the the kind of the later complications in Kenya, but he's already starting to suggest some criticism, some anxieties about what is going to happen, and I'll talk about those more when we look at the various different characters and plot events. Grain of Wheat's the last novel that he wrote in English, and he's been a huge campaigner for writing in African languages. He sort of revised Grain of Wheat quite a bit, but he really says that he's been an active advocate of promoting African languages, and he now writes in Gikuyu, just to kind of say, no, this is where we are, this is where we come from, let's write in our own language. So let's flick on to the next slide, which is Kenya and British colonization. Kenya is part of the British Empire from 1920 to 1963, so it has a long legacy. Most of the characters in this novel do not remember a time before. I mean, I'm not sure anybody is cited here as being old enough to remember a time before British colonization. we're looking at a lot of novels about colonization and looking at colonization in different parts of the world, but this is really about it's really about the state of emergency, which is the term that often kind of gets used for the uprising, the Mau Mau uprising. It's often called of essentially the Kenyan rebellion against the British colonizers. Begins in 1952, so it's a long time, and some of the earlier dates here are very slightly hazy about when various things happen, where people get detained. We're looking back at characters like Kihika, exactly when that's happening, but it gets its freedom in 1963, and what we need to know at this point is that this is about a country on the verge of freedom. This word uhuru that we get thrown at us right at the beginning. This is the Kenyan Day of Freedom that they're approaching, and that moves us into this moment of crisis for our main character Mugo, and it's a time of resolution. So he has to come to terms with who he is and what he's done, and what we think of him as a character, and what we think of his actions, and what other people think of his actions. This is a very interesting novel of showing internal narratives and external points of view. Look at how the different characters are perceived by other characters, which again I'm going to go into in a little bit more detail. The village, if you flick onto the next slide, the village of Thabai is a fictional one, but in many ways typical of a lot of towns in Kenya. We have a very specific dating for the kind of the present events that are happening in the novel. It goes from the 8th to the 12th of December 1963. And we have a lot of characters in this. So I've written at the bottom here, it's a third person omniscient polyvocal text. Third person means it's in third person. We don't have any I narratives. And omniscient, as I'm sure you know, all-knowing. This just means that we jump into the perspective of lots of different characters. So we can start in Mugo's perspective and know all of his interior thoughts, but then we will also jump to Karanja's perspective, we will jump to Gikonyo's perspective, and we will get kind of a depth and a background for each of those characters, and we get to see what they're thinking. And it's also quite interesting that we have some of the British colonizers here as well. We have John and Marjorie Thompson. We get to hear what their point of view is, and it's a really interesting passage to look at John Thompson's kind of vision of the British Empire, of what it was going to be, which is very balanced here. It gives us this very broad perspective and shows the idealism and the dangers of idealism, how the community sort of glorifies Mugo, who by the end of the novel we've seen everything about him, and we haven't really seen anything extraordinarily heroic. We know quite a few quite dark secrets, including just like how he feels around other people, how much he hates his aunt at the beginning of the novel, how much he doesn't want other people to come into his life, and is this wonderful freedom fighter that everybody thinks he is. No, he's absolutely not. So I've kind of slightly broken down on this slide the different kind of groups. So we have the villagers preparing for the celebration, and these are the majority of our characters. Waruri and Wambui we get at the beginning. Mugo, Gikonyo, Mumbi, there's quite a few there, but those are Mugo, Gikonyo, and Mumbi are probably three of our central characters. We have the Home Guard. The Home Guard are the Kenyans who are recruited to work for the British. And so Karanja is an interesting example of this, and what his place is in this new society is very interesting. Everyone suspects him of having betrayed Kihika, although he hasn't, but just because he's someone who went and sort of worked for the British, he is very much doubted and suspected. We have, as I mentioned, the British preparing to leave. John and Marjorie Thompson, and we have a lot of mention also of the fallen freedom fighters. So Kihika is dead at the start of the novel, but he's so present in this novel. So of the people who knew him, the memories of him from childhood, from Mugo and Gikonyo, Mumbi is his sister, and everybody absolutely glorifies him. He is a hero. He is someone who fought for the freedom that they're about to attain. And we actually get some of his speeches in quite some length, and we see him through lots of different eyes again. So what I'm gonna do is I'll now pause here, start a whole new video on kind of going into some depth on the different characters and a couple of the major themes of the novel. So this is our introduction. Another video coming in a second.